This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Go to patreon.com/trifles to learn more. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 367, The Underground Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you, I take it you're above ground for this discussion.
Oh, yes. I don't start hibernating until after the Baker Street Irregulars dinner. And then
perfect.
I'm just sort of in the cave until the 1st of April.
How appropriate. Well, today, the day that this episode is being released is January 10th. We are on our way to New York for the BSI weekend. It's where a bunch of Sherlockians get together every year, early January. And it's appropriate that we are talking about the underground adventures of Sherlock Holmes because this is the first in a series of monthly episodes that we are going to do this season that are related to travel. So we thought it would be appropriate to kick it off with this particular piece of scholarship, which is from our late friend John Besh. John passed away in November of 2023. He was a good friend of mine for, since 1991, really, long time. And John worked in the railroad industry and was very knowledgeable about all things related to the rail. And this particular subject, The Underground Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, is the title of an article in the Baker Street Journal, volume 54, number 4, from 2004. This is part of our ongoing look at scholarship that we bring to our listeners here at Trifles, and we thought we'd share John's with you on the theme of travel. So if you'd like to support the show, you can do so at Patreon. We've got a link to it in our show notes, or just go to patreon.com/trifles. You can also find the show notes for this episode at sherlockholmespodcast.com, or you can sign up for email updates and look around at our full archives there. And I should note that this year our Patreon supporters are going to get a complimentary, it's part of your membership, and comprehensive guide to all of our Trifles episodes, an index of sorts that'll help you search through and find the topics that are relevant to you and your interest in Sherlock Holmes. So check that out and support us on Patreon. Okay, well, we, of course, are glad to be back here talking about travel as we set off to New York City. Burt, why don't you set up this wonderful essay by John for us?
John was a fabulous fellow. He was an inveterate traveler, and the only thing he loved more than travel and playing the great game was his enjoyment in meeting the people in the Sherlockian world. But ever since his college days, really, he developed quite an expertise. He worked professionally in railways. He was a consultant on various complex transportation projects outside the United States, inside the United States, lived in London for 2 years. And this was his great specialty, transportation, particularly railroads. And so John starts with an observation about the London Underground. It's, he commented, of course, that the Metropolitan Circle line, and if you've been on the London Underground, you know that the mapping of it and the locations of the stations and the evolution of the train network has been fascinating over time. But John points out the Metropolitan Circle line that serves Baker Street, the Bakerloo line, the Jubilee line, the Hammersmith and City lines. Wonderful names of these various railway routes that are so much better than New York City's Independent and IND and L and C and D trains. But each of these platforms have distinctive Sherlockian decorations. But anyway, he says at the outset, look, let's talk about the only line open to Baker Street at Holmes's time, and it was then called the Metropolitan Line. It was a circle service that was operated in conjunction with another railway, the Metropolitan District Railway, which built the southern half of the circle. It was completed in 1884 with the opening of Aldgate Station and a connection to the southern half of the circle at Minories Junction, which play an important role in the Bruce Partington plans.
Yeah, that is the classic story that fundamentally involved the railway. It was key to the beginning and the solution of the story. And I don't know if you've seen these side-by-side illustrations, but there was a shot of the Baker Street station in the I think it was the 1860s, back when it first opened, versus present day. And it's hardly changed a bit. And John talks about this. He says, the original Metropolitan Line platforms at Baker Street have been beautifully restored to look as they did in Sherlock Holmes's day. They now are served by the Hammersmith and City Line and the Circle Line. And originally, much of the London Underground was just beneath the city streets, hence Underground. And he said this can be seen most prominently on the present-day Circle Line, which has many line segments in a cut without covering open to the air. This cut and cover type of construction minimized construction costs and also allowed for ventilation, because the underground trains at Baker Street at the time of the Bruce Partington plans were steam-hauled.
Yeah, well, that steam has got to go somewhere, and that is why they were open to the air. And John, draws the contrast between that to the subways and the metros and today's London Underground. So in 1895, the Metropolitan Line operated itself more like an ordinary mainline railway. It just happened to be underground. And he's got some wonderful facts here that had missed me or I had not recalled. He says, for example, on the Underground, the Metropolitan Line in 1895, one could travel first class or third class. We see it in A Study in Scarlet when Watson cries about the ineffable twaddle of a magazine article, which he doesn't know that Holmes was the author. He says, I wish this fellow could be clapped down in a third-class carriage on the Underground and asked to give the trades of all his fellow travelers. And Holmes, of course, says, well, you'd lose your money because, I would be able to do that. But that I never paid any attention to that. Clapped down in a third-class carriage on the Underground and asked to give the trades of all of his fellow passengers. So this establishes the Underground as the way everybody gets to work.
Yeah.
And that's something that hasn't changed in the century since.
Yeah, and John also mentions that in those days, in 1895, passengers would sit on horsehair stuffed seats. The more stuffing, the higher the class. There was food service on some Metropolitan trains. Trains carried baggage until until quite recently, the Metropolitan line carried freight to Smithfield and East London, Smithfield being a meat market. And John writes, imagine standing on the Metropolitan line platform at Baker Street on an English summer day waiting for the train when you hear the rumble of an approaching train and see the triangle of white headlamps on the approaching locomotive, only to discover when it arrives that behind the hissing steam engine, it's not your first-class carriage, but a draft of freight wagons loaded with pigs for Smithfield Market. And that's why it had to be ventilated.
Well, it's a lovely contrast, because, of course, it's quaint and maybe a little hot and maybe smelly. But the fact is, compared to what was going on above ground, the air was probably sweeter on the underground than it was with all the horses and the horse manure and the traffic on the Marylebone Road. And Holmes probably experienced this themselves on their one documented underground journey in the canon. Only one documented journey when they took the underground, presumably from Baker Street, to Aldersgate, which today is the modern Barbican station, to look at Jabez Wilson's shop in Saxe Coburg Square in the Red-Headed League.
Well, that's fascinating right there, because I really hadn't thought about Holmes and underground travel. I mean, Holmes and Watson, iconically in their railway compartment, as immortalized by Sidney Paget, particularly in Silver Blaze. I think it was also in Boscombe Valley Mystery, but Silver Blaze is the iconic one. We think, that of course, that was in a railway carriage. We don't really stop to think about Holmes and Watson in the underground.
No, because they're frequently taking cabs.
That's right.
And in cabs. And in one case, Holmes is actually driving a cab. I think in The Man with the Twisted Lip, maybe
that's right.
After he picks up Watson at the Bar of Gold. Yeah.
But John goes on to say, putting ourselves in this picture of taking the underground and what it was like, he helps emphasize the irony that we often like Sherlock Holmes because the stories take us to a comfortable world in a time far back where good and evil were better labeled and good won out. Now, to the people who bought the Strand in the last decade of the 19th century, the stories were up to date and modern. With an 1890 perspective, the quaint, overcrowded underground was modern, high-tech transportation that conquered time and distance of cross-London journeys at affordable fares. Today's subways use tokens, smart cards, proofs of purchase. The purpose of this newer technology is generally to save staff in the stations and counting rooms. In 1895, underground management wasn't terribly concerned with saving staff. The fare system used on the London Underground involved buying a ticket at the origin station, and the ticket was inspected at the barrier. On reaching the destination station, the passenger surrendered the ticket to the gateman, who inspected it to ensure the passenger had not overridden the zone limits of the ticket. This 100% inspection of tickets, both at origin and destination, made Cadogan West's lack of a ticket a dog that didn't bark in the night. I love that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So here it calls to mind the fact that London in Holmes's day had far fewer people, and the volumes that one thinks about when you think about underground and metro and subway riding today were not a factor of life in Holmes's day. And so you had the relatively leisurely practice of buying a ticket, getting a paper ticket, keeping it in your pocket, getting off the train, and showing it to someone on the way out, which is not, if you tried to do something like that today, people would be queued up for a mile trying to get into the underground.
Yeah, and I can't remember which metro station it is. Maybe it's in D.C., where you have your card, and don't you have to pass it through the gate in order to get in and out?
Oh, I don't remember that. I do remember the D.C. subway was one of the first to adopt that sort of carded payment system, but that was years ago.
Well, of course, the old MBTA in Boston was made famous in the 1950s or 60s with the folk song Charlie and the MTA, where Charlie didn't have enough fare to get off. So he was stuck in an endless loop riding the MTA.
Yeah. It's interesting when you think about the history of all of these systems, because in New York City and in other cities, tokens were employed, and tokens have been employed over the years, different sizes, different metal stamped tokens, different machines for collecting them. So what you would do is buy a handful or a roll or a stack of these things, keep them in your pocket and use them for a week, and they'd be collected and recycled. Whole industries came and went around fueling passage on these transportation systems.
Yeah. I have a pair of cufflinks that are old New York City subway tokens that were repurposed.
Oh, very good. Very good.
You can't do that with the smart card now.
They'd be very big cufflinks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then Cadogan West, you've mentioned how important this is. When, the first thing you learn in the story is where his journey ended. It was just east of the station platform at Aldgate on the Metropolitan line. And John has investigated this and tells us we can even get a little more precise. Because east of Aldgate Station, there's a complex series of switches and crossovers called Minories Junction. And at these kinds of junctions or crossovers, it's very difficult to maintain the distance between the rails precisely. Precise 4 feet, 8.5 inches, going through the switches or going through the points in the English parlance. Because what happens is the lateral forces exerted by the movement of the train. So you have to imagine the train, the weight of the train moving in a curve, and the lateral pressure tend to force the gauge wider. Even only a 1/16 of an inch, it's enough to make the equipment rock at slow speeds, and at higher speeds, it gives you a pronounced jolt. And I love that reference there because it just shows you part of John's technical skill and knowledge, which, completely pass over ordinary mortals.
Yeah, and it's something we've all experienced. We may not have realized we were experiencing or what it meant when we were experiencing it, but that's the reason behind it.
Yeah, and the train rocks because of crossing the switches at Minories Junction, and the jolting, this rocking, is what tips Cadogan West's body off the roof of the car.
And John lets us know that Aldgate Station was relatively new at the time, having opened in mid-November of 1876. So much for where West got off. It remains to be seen where he got on his last ride. And it's been the subject of some debate, John writes, since 13 Caulfield Gardens is a Watsonian substitution. There's been some considerable search for houses in Kensington that would abut the Underground Railway in the rear. It had to be a suitable middle-class dwelling. It would not pose a problem in itself because, as on the Philadelphia Main Line, living next to the railroad tracks carried no stigma. In fact, the opposite was true. There was no snob value in living next to the railroad. There was snob value in living next to the railroad. David Hammer has settled on a house on Hogarth Road, Southwest 5, that abuts the present-day district and circle lines between Earl's Court and High Street, Kensington. Now, if that were the case, John concludes, Cadogan West's last journey would have taken him through Baker Street Station on the Metropolitan line, en route to his final destination at Aldgate, riding on the roof. He would have passed practically under the noses of a likely sleeping Holmes and Watson, who were later to solve the mystery of Cadogan West's death and German espionage plot by converting the Underground's catchphrase, "Mind the gap," to "Mind the roof." Now, years ago, I seem to remember writing something up on ihearofsherlock.com about a particular house in London that is nothing but a facade. Goodness. I'm going to have to go back and search for that. So this, having finally found it, this was an entry from January 29th, 2014. Wow, almost 10 years ago now. Weeks shy of 10 years. And this was inspired by an entry from the Now I Know newsletter. This entry is called The Original Empty House, Mind the Gap. We reference what happened in the Bruce Partington plans, but of particular interest is the true empty house of London. If you happen to find yourself in Bayswater, London, you'll have the opportunity to visit numbers 23 and 24 Leinster Gardens. But there is no home at this location. It looks like there is, but it's just a facade of a house. And there are extensive photos on a website called 150 Great Things About the Underground. It shows that 23 and 24 were never built as houses. Instead, and this goes back to what John mentioned about the Metropolitan line. He said the Metropolitan, now the District and Circle lines, needed some ventilation for steam trains. So rather than leave an open railway in the midst of a residential area, the facades of houses were built to match the rest of the neighborhood, and then the rear was left open for ventilation.
Absolutely fascinating.
So Leinster Gardens was replaced with Coalfield Gardens, and Bayswater became Kensington in Watson's telling of the tale. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
In some areas, the London Underground runs clear of tunnels and past the backs of houses. When I found that a leading international agent lived in just such a house, I was so pleased that you were a little astonished at my sudden frivolity.
Hugo Oberstein, 13 Coalfield Gardens, of course.